Welcome, everyone, to the second session of the day. We have three speakers, two speakers and a discussant. The first speaker is Clara Marton from the CUNY Graduate Center, where she is a professor in the program of Speech, Language, Hearing Sciences. She's an expert on changes in language and cognition across the lifetime and in the interaction between inhibition and intentional control. In 2013, she and her colleagues demonstrated that balanced but not L2 learning bilingual children outperformed monolinguals modulated by language proficiency. The second speaker is Antonella Sorace from the University of Edinburgh. She's professor of developmental linguistics in the School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences. She is an expert on the reciprocal effects of bilingualism and general cognition, and she is the principal investigator on various United Kingdom and European grants. She is the founder and director of Bilingualism Matters, a network that promotes benefits of bilingualism for children. And our final speaker is Virginia Gathercole from Florida International University, where she is professor of linguistics and is an expert on monolingual and bilingual language acquisition in relation to semantics, morphosyntax, and assessment. Her work also addresses issues concerning the relationship between language and cognition. She specializes in the acquisition of English, Spanish, and Welsh in Spanish-English and Welsh-English bilinguals. We'll follow the format we followed so far. Each speaker will speak, and then we will have a group discussion. So, Clara, thank you.
Welcome, everyone. And first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. As you know from the literature, I'm not a real bilingual expert. My research on executive functions is really more related to clinical populations. So most of my work I've done with children with specific language impairment, with autism, ADHD, so this is a relatively new area for me, doing research with children and young adults who are bilingual. So I would like to start with the acknowledgement. Some of the research, the development of our tasks and experimental paradigms was supported by NIDCD, and some of the data collection in Hungary was supported by a European Union social fund. We also had several internal CUNY grants supporting our research. First, I would like to say a special thank you to one of my doctoral students who helped with all the data analysis, Luca Campanelli, for his help. And also, I would like to acknowledge two of my colleagues at the Graduate Center, Mira Goral and Lorraine Obler, who really started thinking about, made me think actually about bilingualism, and we started our discussions, and our first study on bilingualism was a collaborative study. Here is a picture of my students from the lab. They are all sitting here smiling to support me. And there are several doctoral students and master's students who were involved at different stages in these studies. I'm going to present data from 3 studies. I will focus on 2 studies that involve children, because this is the children's section, but then I would like to show you some common patterns, and I will compare our children data to data from young adults that we collected previously. So I could really skip the whole introduction because it's it's a repetition of the previous session. So everything that we heard in the discussion, that's exactly how I try to organize my talk. So I will go through it very quickly. The main question is there a bilingual cognitive advantage in children? And there is evidence for and against it. So if you look at the literature, there are mixed findings. And even within the findings that support a bilingual advantage, there is some disagreement whether this is related to specific cognitive or executive components, or is it related more to a global overall speed of processing advantage. So what are the factors behind these inconsistencies? Basically, our discussants here in the previous session mentioned all of them. So participants' variables that we have discussed, for example, language proficiency, language of education seem to have an effect, similarities between the languages, age of acquisition, speed of processing, and I could go on. As we know in the literature, there are many variables that people have associated with executive functioning. Then there is also socioeconomic status. The cultural background seems to have an effect. So moving from the individual to the larger societal level, we see all these associations. Now, the other group of variables are related to tasks. So we have seen that people are using different tasks. The tasks don't correlate. Some people use certain subtests from standardized tests and found mixed results. Some people used tasks such as the Wisconsin card sorting task that was mentioned this morning, or the Stroop task that was mentioned yesterday. And many of these tasks provide global scores. So if we find or not find any differences, we are not really sure what those outcomes mean, often because they reflect different executive components. For example, the score on the Wisconsin card sorting task may signal working memory differences, or may signal attention switching differences, or may signal inhibition differences. And just from the score, we will not know. So it seems to me, after reviewing the literature, that tasks that used different experimental manipulations seem to be more sensitive to the bilingual advantage, and they seem to be more successful in explaining where we see advantages and where we don't. So all of our studies are based on one experimental paradigm that we developed for clinical populations, have tested with hundreds of children before we started testing in bilingual populations. Now, variability is also related to the functions. As it has been discussed during these 2 days, executive functions are related to various components. People mean different things when they talk about executive functions. They refer to different functions. So in the children literature, we see that people have looked at visual perspective taking, for example, using global local tasks, working memory, short-term memory, response inhibition, withholding response, etc. So I tried to give a summary in the next table where I don't want to go over every single study. I just wanted to point out that if you look at here on the left side, I listed various executive functions that have been tested. And then on the top, I listed various language and cognitive factors that have been looked at in association with different executive components. And what we see, I just wanted to point out that what we see here are many X's and many check marks. So it really just shows the literature review that there are mixed findings. Certain variables have been tested more frequently. So many people looked at, for example, the association between speed of processing and different executive components, and the findings are somewhat mixed. Fewer studies have looked at, for example, similarities between languages. The most consistent patterns seem to be related to response inhibition, although there is one study where they found a bilingual advantage in a specific group, but most people did not find any bilingual advantage across different studies. But otherwise, the data are really mixed. So, based on the literature review, it seems that their factors are related to tasks, factors are related to the bilingual person, and factors are related to society, culture, SES. So the first study I'm going to present, we conducted here in New York City with children whose primary language was English. They spoke various other languages, but they were English dominant. There were two large groups, including children who were Russian-speaking and including children who were Spanish-speaking children. And then we had children speaking Chinese and Hindi and various different languages. So the goal of this study was, first of all, to look at the relationship between language proficiency and executive processing in school-age children using language proficiency as a continuous variable. Yesterday we heard, and we know from the literature, bilingualism is not a category. So in order to see how language proficiency interacts with different executive functions, we use language proficiency as a continuous variable. And the first goal was to look at whether there's an overall relationship between increase in proficiency and different executive functions. The second goal was a little bit more specific. We wanted to see whether we can identify certain executive components where children who differ in language proficiency might perform differently. So this goal was more related to specific pattern analysis. The third goal was to examine whether there is this global advantage in terms of speed of processing among children who differ in language proficiency. And the last one was to examine whether there are other language factors that might also influence outcomes on executive functions in addition to language proficiency, and we looked at the frequency of language use. So now the participants, both studies I'm going to discuss in details are ongoing, they are in progress. We had 52 children, and we are still collecting data because as you can see, we have a really nice distribution. Oh, sorry. What happened? Distribution in terms of language proficiency from 0 to 10. We have children at every proficiency level, and we have a nice distribution in terms of age. But here, for example, we need a few more children who are low proficient, most likely more second language learners than really bilinguals, because these are somewhat more proficient than monolingual children. And similarly to having difficulty in Barcelona, we had the same difficulty in New York. There are no monolingual children, so we went to New Jersey collecting the data for the monolingual group. So these are the New York children, and these are New Jersey children. Just quickly to show age and IQ and self-scores to show that all these children were typically developing. We tested just to include children, and we excluded anybody who didn't meet our criteria of average range. And the second graph shows the gender distribution. We are still working on it because we are still recruiting children, but we have a pretty good gender distribution already. So the task. I'm showing you this task now because we use the same task in all three studies. And this is the task that we developed, as I said, for clinical purposes, and we have data from several hundred of children already, so we know what works, what doesn't. It's a task that consists of 10 subtasks, and for these studies, we only used 4 of them. It's a very simple verbal baseline. I keep pressing the wrong button, sorry. There's a very simple verbal baseline task where it's a categorization task. the child sees, for example, the category toy, and then there's a stimulus, let's say ball. They have to decide whether it's a target or a distractor item. If it's a member of the category, it's a target. If it's not, then it's a distractor item, and they have to press different buttons. It's very simple. All the words were high-frequency words acquired during preschool ages, and we are testing children around between 8 and 10 years. So these words are not a problem for these children. Now, we did different manipulations, and I just want to point to this one, where prior to each category, we inserted a pure tone nonverbal cue, because the literature suggests that if we are giving a nonverbal cue that is not interfering with the category, then children might orient their attention better, and if they pay more attention, then we can measure performance monitoring better. So this we used for performance monitoring purposes, this condition. The same task, but different manipulations. We wanted to see whether children, bilingual children or highly proficient children show different learning curves than monolingual children. There are very few learning studies, and this is just really a first step to look at implicit learning in these populations. So there were certain categories where the manipulation was that we presented specific target items 4 times, and then we compared performance across those repeated items. And the last manipulation was to look at proactive interference, which has been suggested in the literature that bilingual children are more resistant to proactive interference. And for this, what we did is, if, let's say, the first category was family, and then mother was a target item. And then we had several repetitions. We have here hundreds of items, so we have a very large number of items in each of these conditions. And let's say family was followed by sports, then some of the distractor items were items that have not been presented previously. So let's say if it's family and then sports, then some of the distractor items might be like book or table, something that doesn't belong to either category. But then some of the distractor items were items that were previously targets. So for sports, for example, we would use sister or mother as distractor item, which was a target in the previous category, and that's how we created proactive interference condition. So what we also gave the children a very simple nonverbal baseline task, which was a vigilance task. There was a colored circle, and they had to press a button every time the circle appeared on the monitor, just to see this global advantage in speed of processing. But it was a very simple task, and we don't see any differences across language proficiency in the nonverbal baseline. In the verbal baseline, however, we found significant differences in both accuracy and reaction time. So as you can see here on the X is language proficiency, and here we have accuracy, here we have reaction time. With an increase in language proficiency, accuracy increases, reaction time decreases. So we see this global advantage at the verbal baseline level. In terms of implicit learning, accuracy data didn't show any difference across proficiency levels. And here I'm showing 2 graphs, and although we used proficiency as a continuous variable, it's hard to visualize it. So we are using at 0 point, and this is 10, and this is 0 point. So the 2 extremes, the monolingual children and the most proficient bilingual children, just to show the proficiency, but in the analysis, the variable was continuous, not categorical. So what we are seeing here in terms of accuracy, there is no difference. But if we look at reaction time data, we see that the more proficient bilingual children are faster than the monolingual children. However, there is no interaction. So everybody benefited from one repetition, and then the children don't differ in terms of proficiency level and repetition across the items. It's just a global processing speed advantage. Proactive interference, resistance to interference in terms of accuracy, we see a clear effect of language proficiency because the more efficient children are more accurate, and we see a clear effect of interference, which is good because it means that the task is working. In terms of reaction time, we see an interesting interaction. What we are seeing here that the monolingual and low proficient children show a relatively larger interference intrusion cost, interference effect, than the children who are most proficient, who are not really showing an interference effect. Actually, it's like a facilitation effect because they perform better in the interference condition than in the baseline condition. So we wanted to look at this and to see what might be behind this. And we chose all the children who, it's not a large sample, unfortunately, so we need more data, but we chose the children whose proficiency was at least 8.5, 9, and up, so 9 or 10. And when we looked at their language use, we found that half of them use the L2, if you want, so not the dominant English language, but the other language, about 10% of the time, whereas the other half use it 50-50%, so they are frequent users of both languages. And when we compared the data according to the language use, what we found was this is intrusion cost. So what we are seeing here in proactive interference is that the children who although the proficiency is the same for all these children, 8.5 and 9 and 10, those children who use their one language, not the dominant language, only 10% of the time they show an intrusion cost, whereas children who use both languages daily basis 50-50% of the time, they show more like a facilitation. So if we look at the graph, basically these children here are the children who are not just highly proficient, but they also use both languages very frequently on a daily basis, equally frequently. So this shows that in addition to language frequency, language use has also an effect. Now, in terms of performance monitoring, what we see is an effect of the tone conditions. So when we give a nonverbal cue, everybody slows down, so they perform better. And here we used post-error slowing as a measure because the literature suggests that if you pay more attention and you monitor your performance, then you catch your errors, and after you make an error, you will slow down. So post-error slowing has been used in the literature frequently to signal performance monitoring. And what we see here is that all children show, if we give a tone, all children show post-error slowing, but this post-error slowing is not related to language proficiency because there's no interaction. And we see an error monitoring condition interaction, meaning that if there is no tone spontaneously, children don't monitor their performance so well as if they have a nonverbal cue, but it's not related to proficiency. They are all performing similarly. So then we looked at how this performance monitoring is related to language use in the highly proficient bilingual children, and we found a similar pattern to proactive interference, that children who use both languages very frequently, they show the larger effect of the tone, so they were able to take more advantage of the nonverbal cue, and they showed larger post-error slowing, meaning that they monitor their performance better than children who use the other language less frequently. So again, further evidence that even if the language proficiency is matched, language use frequency has also an effect on some of these executive components. So to summarize the data from the first study, there's an association between language proficiency and executive processing, but this relationship is not a unitary one. Bilingual advantage is very clear in proactive interference on both accuracy and reaction time. But in the other components, performance monitoring and implicit learning and verbal baseline, we found similar patterns across proficiency levels. However, overall speed of processing seems to show positive correlation in most executive component tasks with language proficiency. And in addition to language proficiency, we see that frequency of language use shows also an interaction. So those highly proficient bilingual children who use both languages regularly show smaller intrusion costs, so better resistance to proactive interference, and they also show larger post-error slowing, meaning better performance monitoring. Based on this, we wanted to look at another population. This is a very interesting population, Hungarian-Romanian children who live in Transylvania. So Transylvania used to belonged to Hungary prior to the Second World War. And these are Hungarian cities and towns where the people speak Hungarian, children go to Hungarian schools. However, all children have to take the state exams in Romanian, and during the socialism, Ceausescu actually moved many Romanian families from Bucharest and other parts of the country to these Hungarian towns because they wanted them to assimilate. He didn't want these Hungarian communities to stay alive, basically. So now these towns are very mixed. There are Romanian and Hungarian families living together, but the Hungarian families have these roots that are very strong. Their identity is very much Hungarian, and they speak the language, and every child speaks Hungarian as their first language and dominant language. So on the other hand, these communities are now separated by the border, and on the Hungarian side, we find children from from similar cultures, similar traditions, similar socioeconomic status, who are clearly monolingual. They only speak Hungarian, they don't speak other languages. And so we wanted to compare executive processing in highly proficient bilingual children from similar cultural background, SES, and language of education than the monolingual children, and to examine the relationship between executive processing in these highly proficient children. So this is a study that's ongoing. Unfortunately, we lost half of the data in the bilingual participants, so we are going back in June and collecting more data. So this is a very small sample, I'm aware of it, but we saw some interesting trends. So right now we have 18 monolingual Hungarian children from Hungary and 13 from the Romanian side of the border who are bilingual. Ages 8 to 10, everybody is Hungarian dominant. The parents judge their children's Romanian language knowledge, somewhat varied. Most parents said excellent, very good, and good. These children take the state exams in Romanian. They have Romanian friends. From the questionnaire, all children speak Romanian with their friends, and they use it on a regular basis. So these are highly proficient, balanced, bilingual children. In the nonverbal baseline task, so now, based on the lesson we learned from the American children, we used more than just one baseline test because the vigilance test didn't show anything. So we added some interference conditions and inhibition conditions, but it's still a very simple task. Circles appear and children have to respond to blue and green circles. But what we see here, interestingly, that there is a bilingual effect, and actually there is also an interaction because there is difference in task complexity, and the larger the complexity in these really simple nonverbal tasks, the bilingual children show larger bilingual advantage. On the other hand, unlike the American children in verbal baseline, these children don't show an advantage, and actually this is not significant, but the trend, if we have more children, I'm not sure, it seems that we find a bilingual disadvantage in verbal baseline. So it's really the reverse pattern than the American data. We'll see why. Same task, so I'm not mentioning the tasks again. Implicit learning, nice interaction. Bilingual children start somewhat slower, but show a steeper learning curve with repetition than the monolingual children. And we see all these interactions across repetition items. So the bilingual children are more efficient, and although they start slower, eventually they are faster than the bilingual children, the monolingual children. There's also a correlation between language use and learning curves. So those children who used more frequently, both Romanian and Hungarian language, they showed a steeper curve. So their learning curve was steeper. They were more efficient. In terms of proactive interference, very similar results to the American children. Finally, something is similar. Everybody is affected by interference negatively, but the bilingual children show better resistance, they show better accuracy, and they show, again, this interesting that they are almost faster in the interference condition than in the baseline condition, what we have seen in the American data as well. So there's a group effect condition and proficiency condition interaction, similarly to the American children. There's also a correlation with having a steeper learning curve in the previous task and smaller intrusion costs. So it seems that children who are more balanced bilinguals and use both languages more frequently show steeper learning curve, are more efficient, and they also show then smaller intrusion costs. So more efficiency in both tasks. In performance monitoring, here we are really lacking power. So unfortunately, we just need more children. We don't see any post-error slowing in either group. I think it's because we have too few participants. And right now, actually, when we gave the tone, the nonverbal cue resulted in faster performance in the monolinguals, but nothing happened in these bilingual children. So we need to follow up on this. However, there was a negative correlation when we looked at individual data between post-error slowing and implicit learning. So those few children who had a really steep learning curve still showed some post-error slowing, but you can't see it at the group level. So to summarize these findings, several significant interactions have been observed. Reaction time in implicit learning, bilingual children showed steeper learning curve, monolingual children showed larger intrusion costs, so better proactive interference in bilingual children, and in performance monitoring, monolingual children benefited from the cue, but nobody showed any post-error slowing. Unlike the American children, these children did not differ from their monolingual peers in verbal baseline, but showed an advantage in nonverbal baseline measures. And this verbal baseline might be related to the immersion in the Romanian culture and language. Because these children, although yes, they are dominant in Hungarian and they were tested in Hungarian, they live in a society where the official language is Romanian. So we are not sure at this point, it's really more like a speculation, but it's possible that that's why they are at the baseline somewhat slower in Hungarian, because they are immersed in Romanian language. So that's what I basically said. Speed of processing beyond the baseline shows that with each repetition in implicit learning, bilingual children showed larger improvement in reaction time than monolingual children. The interference cost in reaction time is larger for the monolingual children, and again, we discussed that. Significant correlations, more balanced bilingual children showed more efficient implicit learning, and those children showed more efficient resistance to proactive interference, and also some post-error slowing. Now, before I go to the conclusions, I just want to show you some common patterns across these two studies, and now I want to add the young adults. These young adults, it's 77 young adults, bilingual and monolingual, young adults from New York City whose dominant language was English. Again, they spoke various other languages. And I just want to show you that proactive interference is where we found the most robust effect, because regardless of age, these young adults are 18 to 35-year-old, we find a significant bilingual advantage in resisting proactive interference. We see it with language proficiency in the American children, we see it in the Hungarian children, and we see it in the American young adults. So this is the most robust finding, because here we have very consistent data. Some of the accuracy data I'm not showing because they are ceiling, particularly for the young adults. It's very simple, but the reaction time data show very similar patterns. Now, we also have some conflicting results. In terms of verbal baseline, as I mentioned, American children show, the bilingual children show an advantage. The English-speaking young adults show an advantage. The Hungarian children almost, there's no difference. It seems like there will be, once we collect more data, if the trend stays, then it might be even a disadvantage, but this is what we are speculating, that this is related to language context, most likely, to the society. Implicit learning. We saw that the Hungarian bilingual children showed a nice interaction, steep learning curve, and we see a very similar steep learning curve for the American young adults. With one repetition, these young adults were matched, so the intercept, there's no difference because we matched the monolingual and the bilingual young adults at the verbal baseline level in speed of processing, but we see that the bilingual show a much steeper learning curve with one repetition and then they stay, whereas the monolinguals show this gradual decrease. Now, why don't we see the same pattern in the American children? One reason might be that these two studies used monolingual versus bilingual children. So we had two categories, and here we used proficiency as a continuous variable. So because we used it as a continuous variable, you know, it's a stronger design and you see advantages, but it might also show different pattern, and here we don't see the interaction. When we had Virginia refer to the 2013 study, some of the children were the same, and we had two categories, bilingual and monolingual children at that point, and we saw the same interaction in the American children. So this might be related, the lack of interaction, to using a continuous variable as for the proficiency. In terms of implicit learning, I summarized from the graphs, and then in monitoring, all the take-home message here is that it seems that across all three studies, there is no difference between bilingual and monolingual and highly proficient and low proficient participants in terms of performance pattern. Yes, the adults show this beautiful post-error slowing, but the two groups don't differ. The American children do show the post-error slowing, but proficiency doesn't matter, and the Hungarian children just don't show anything because there are very few of them. But it seems that performance monitoring will be something where overall speed of processing seems to play an important role because highly proficient children are faster. Of course, the adults not because they are matched. But beyond overall speed of processing, we don't see anything. So to conclude, as suggested by different theoretical models, such as Miyake et al. 2000, executive functions are independent functions, but they interact with each other, and that's what we see in our findings across these studies. And they also interact with various language functions. They show a relationship with language proficiency, so more proficient bilingual participants showed more efficient learning, for example, and smaller intrusion costs. But proficiency is not the only language measure we have to look at, because it seems that the frequency of language use has also an effect on executive function performance, so we need more studies there. There is a bilingual advantage in resistance to proactive interference across age groups and languages. That's clear from these 3 studies. And there's a global processing advantage in terms of speed in most of the executive function tasks that we looked at. So if I wanted to summarize it, we started this morning with saying that these questions are very, very complex, but there's no reason for not discussing them just because they are too complex. So my graph will be very, very complex, but I think we made a few first steps that will help us to formulate further questions. So if we look at, these were the executive functions that we looked at in this study, and yeah, they were somewhat independent, but they also showed an interaction, and they were clearly related to various individual variables, such as speed of processing and language proficiency and language use. Furthermore, these variables also interact with each other, not just with executive functions. Now, we also see that there are effects of, oops, this looked really different on the Mac. So what I'm trying to show here, that language context, the society, culture, SES, and education, as we know, they all interact with these variables, so there are further variables that make the picture even more complex, and they also interact with each other. We know that, for example, education and SES are related. So the picture is really complex. I didn't put in all the errors because we wouldn't see anything after a while, but I think we have a few first, starting points in the children's literature that are really promising, that we just have to follow up on all these variables. So a few questions that I think, based on our findings, need to be answered. First of all, we need to examine resistance of proactive interference, because that was the most robust effect in linguistically more complex tasks. This was a very simple task. So if we could manipulate proactive interference in linguistically more complex tasks, then maybe that would give us further hints about this bilingual advantage. We also found that balanced bilingual children are typically faster than the less proficient children, and they are also more efficient in certain executive function tasks, so they show, for example, steeper learning curve. What we don't know is whether this efficiency, for example, in learning or resistance to interference, is primarily related to speed of processing or language proficiency, because in our data set, these two correlate. So it's an interesting question, like, what is the driving force here behind these efficiency measures? Is it really the language proficiency? Is it the speed of processing? Or maybe we are just not able to separate it at all. Highly proficient bilingual children show steeper learning curves than their peers. What makes them better learners? I think this is a very important question. Even for clinical populations, if we look at bilingual children with specific language impairment, for example, it would be very important to know why some children learn more efficiently than others. So a few more training studies would be nice here. And another question is, how are language proficiency, language use, and language context related to each other and to specific executive components? We see that they all have an effect, but we don't really see the big picture yet. And then there are many other questions that you probably also have. So I just would like to thank you for your attention. And the 2 cities where all of this was conducted, New York and Budapest.